Hello and welcome to Weekly News Highlights. Let's begin with the keywords that made headlines this week. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung held summit talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in New Delhi, where they agreed to deepen economic and strategic cooperation while calling for stability amid global uncertainties. He also met with Vietnamese leader To Lam in Hanoi to deepen cooperation in energy, infrastructure, and supply chains. South Korea's economy has posted stronger than expected growth to start the year, defying external uncertainties and outperforming forecasts thanks to robust exports and domestic demand driving the surprise expansion. South Korea's rival parties are showing rare bipartisan unity in responding to the Middle East situation, backing measures to cushion economic fallout and support affected industries. President Lee Jae-myung has met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and discussed cooperation on supplies of energy resources and naphtha amid increasing global uncertainties. Our senior Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min filed this report from New Delhi.
The South Korean first couple were given a grand welcome by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Draupadi Murmu. South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung and his Indian counterpart Modi stressed the importance of bilateral cooperation during these turbulent times.
불확실성의 시대 속에서 대한민국과 인도가 상호 성장과 혁신을 촉진하는 최적의 전방위적 협력 파트너가 될 수 있다는 데 서로 공감하였습니다.
Our two countries share common visions in the Indo-Pacific region. Your visit, Mr. President, has elevated our trusted bilateral partnership to one that looks toward the future.
The leaders also exchanged views on regional and global peace amid the current conflict in the Middle East.
우리는 최근 중동 정세에 대한 의견을 교환하며 중동 지역의 안정과 평화 회복이 세계 안보와 경제에 매우 중요하다는 데 공감하였습니다.
Amid heightened international tensions, South Korea and India are sending a concerted message of peace and stability.
Monday's summit yielded key deliverables such as strengthening cooperation on a stable supply of energy resources and naphtha. The leaders agreed to create the Korea-India Industrial Cooperation Committee for cooperation on strategic sectors such as critical minerals and nuclear energy. Also, the two countries plan to upgrade their bilateral economic agreement called SEPA and double their annual trade volume to $50 billion by 2030. Both plan to work together on a host of other areas.
디지털 브릿지 프레임워크를 통해 인공지능 인재 강국인 인도와 세계적 수준의 인공지능 인프라를 갖춘 대한민국 간의 인공지능 디지털 협력 기반을 구축해 나갈 것입니다.
From encouraging exchanges between young talents to cooperation in shipbuilding, environment, and energy, we will expand opportunities to cooperate in a range of fields.
A Mumbai Korea Center will be established to foster cultural exchanges. The talks came at a critical time as South Korea tries to expand its diplomatic horizon to the global south. President Lee's next stop is Vietnam, where he will be sitting down with the nation's top leader. Yoon Jung-min, ArirangNews, New Delhi.
The high-profile selfie is drawing attention not just for who's in the frame, but for what it represents. Taken during President Lee's state visit to India, the image highlights deepening economic ties as both sides push to expand cooperation and double bilateral trade. Our top office correspondent Song Yoo-jin reports.
President Lee Jae-myung, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Samsung Electronics Chairman Lee Jae-yong all in one frame. The selfie taken with the Galaxy Z Flip 7 made at Samsung's Noida factory in India has drawn attention as a snapshot of the growing economic partnership between South Korea and India. A business delegation of around 200 people accompanied President Lee's state visit to India. The strong focus on business even reshaped diplomatic protocol.
The original plan was to hold the Korea-India Business Dialogue ahead of the Korea-India Business Forum. But Prime Minister Modi proposed that business leaders join his lunch with President Xi, and we accepted.
According to the policy chief, talks focused on broadening cooperation beyond traditional sectors such as automobiles and electronics into other industries like shipbuilding and steel. President Lee reinforced that message later in the day at the Korea-India Business Forum.
세계적 수준인 인도의 인공지능 소프트웨어 역량과 한국의 반도체, 배터리, 자동차 조선 등 제조 경쟁력이 결합되면 양국은 막대한 시너지를 낼 수 있을 것입니다.
Calling for a step up in economic cooperation between Seoul and New Delhi, Lee reiterated the goal of doubling bilateral trade to $50 billion a year by 2030. Annual trade between the two countries has hovered around $25 billion in recent years, a level the president said falls short given India's emergence as one of the world's largest economies. To that end, the two countries plan to resume the 12th round of negotiations next month to upgrade their comprehensive economic partnership agreement, aiming to reach a deal by the first half of 2027.
Addressing several non-tariff barriers, making it easier to do business between the two countries, easing the rules of origin, expanding market access, and opening up the doors in both countries.
A total of 20 memorandums of understanding were signed between businesses from the two countries at Monday's forum. One of the key deals involves HD Korea Shipbuilding and Offshore Engineering developing a new shipyard in India. 송미진, 아리랑뉴스.
President Lee Jae-myung and Vietnam's top leader To Lam have held talks amid heightened global uncertainties. Cooperation on energy and railway projects topped the agenda.
President Lee Jae-myung, who is on a state visit to Hanoi, was given a red carpet welcome by To Lam, Vietnam's top political leader. The friendly mood was reflected in Wednesday's summit.
당 서기장께서는 지난해 우리 정부 출범 후에 첫 번째 국빈으로 방한하셨고 또 이번 저의 베트남 방문은 베트남의 새 지도부 출범 후 2주 만에 이루어진 베트남의 첫 국빈 방문으로
Your visit, Mr. President, clearly shows our comprehensive strategic partnership that is based upon strong, effective, and deep trust.
Amid the current tensions in the Middle East, the Korean president said Korea and Vietnam will work together on energy and infrastructure based on profound mutual trust.
최근 중동 상황에서 비롯된 공급망 불안정성 속에서 양국 간 협력의 필요성이 더욱 커졌다는 데 공감하였습니다. 에너지 안보 강화와 공급망 안정을 위해 더욱 긴밀히 협력하기로
A dozen MOUs were signed on energy, infrastructure, and technology, including power infrastructure and nuclear power plants.
Vietnam welcomes Korean companies expanding investment in areas such as infrastructure, smart cities, semiconductors, large-scale AI data centers, nuclear power plants, smart ports, and next-generation ports.
The two countries plan to cooperate on the Ho Chi Minh City Metro Railway, with South Korea's Hyundai Rotem set to play a major part in this $110 million project. Korean firms are also eyeing urban development and airport projects in Vietnam. By 2030, Seoul and Hanoi aim to expand their annual bilateral trade to $150 billion. The two countries signed an MOU to allow exports of heat-treated poultry products, to expand cooperation on agricultural and food products. People-to-people exchanges was also on the agenda.
상대국 국민과 다문화 가정의 안정적인 체류와 권익 증진을 위해 긴밀하게 협력해 나가기로 하였습니다.
We also have agreed to share experiences on culture and entertainment industries, such as film, music, and gaming, and bolster mutual support.
It was the two leaders' second engagement in about 8 months, following the Vietnamese leader's trip to Korea last August. The South Korean president's reciprocal visit to Vietnam so early in his presidency is seen as carrying symbolic significance in terms of Seoul's strategic priorities. Yoon Jung-min, ArirangNews, Hanoi.
President Lee is seeking to deepen strategic ties with Vietnam, focusing on cooperation in nuclear energy, infrastructure, and economic development as both sides look to drive future growth.
Continuing his diplomatic push in Vietnam, President Lee Jae-myung on Thursday held a series of high-level meetings with the country's number 2 and number 3 officials. Yi first met with Prime Minister Lee Min-hung, who oversees the country's economy and administration. Talks focused on deepening economic cooperation, with President Yi presenting South Korea as a reliable partner in supporting Vietnam's rapid growth.
과거에 한국은 원전을 통한 에너지 자립, 고속도로 및 철도를 통한 물류 혁신, 그리고 투명한 금융 결제 시스템이라는 세 가지 핵심 인프라에 집중 투자했습니다. 이러한 물리적, 제도적 토대의 결합이야말로 한국이 단기간에 경제 도약을 이뤄낸 결정적 엔진이었습니다.
Vietnam is pursuing strategic breakthroughs in policy, human resources, and infrastructure, while placing the private sector at the center of economic growth. We hope South Korea will work together with us in supporting these efforts.
Prime Minister Lee Min-hung also invited South Korea's Prime Minister Kim Min-seok to visit Vietnam, with President Yi saying he would convey the invitation and work to arrange the visit soon. Yi later met with National Assembly Chairman Chun Ting-mun, Vietnam's top legislator, where he emphasized the role of Parliament in furthering Seoul and Hanoi's comprehensive strategic partnership.
양국 간 협력이 제도적으로 뒷받침될 수 있도록 양국 의회 간의 교류도 더욱 활성화되기를 기대합니다. 베트남 내 우리 국민의 권익 증진과 한국 기업들의 경영 활동 개선을 위해서도 국회에 지속적인 관심과 지원을 부탁드립니다.
This marks President Yi's first visit to Vietnam since taking office, and the first state visit since Vietnam's 16th National Assembly completed forming its new leadership. It reflects the high importance Vietnam places on its relationship with President Yi, the South Korean government, and South Korea.
As these meetings come just weeks after Vietnam's new administration took office, they are seen as efforts to set a positive tone for bilateral ties in the years ahead. 송유진, 아리랑뉴스.
Korea's lawmakers have shown consensus in the need to support the public during the ongoing difficulties stemming from the situation in the Middle East. And for more on this, we have our political correspondent An Sung-jin with us in the studio today. Welcome, Sung-jin.
Thanks for having me, Soo-jin.
So, Sung-jin, you sat down with the floor leaders of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the National Assembly. What did they say about this issue?
Right, so let's first start off with the economic impact. Nearly 2 months into the crisis in the Middle East, the ripple effects are being felt far beyond the region. In Korea, the prolonged instability has begun to impact a wide range of industries. One key priority emphasized by both sides is mitigating the economic shock. Alongside stabilizing crude oil supply chains, there has been a stronger push to broaden import channels and over the long term accelerate Korea's transition toward renewable energy.
So when we combine those policy measures, in addition to the diversification and the energy safe measures, all in all, we can kind of survive this period of difficulties, and then we can shoot it back to the normal economic situation.
Support for the energy sector has also been reinforced through the supplementary budget. Measures are aimed not only at small business owners and the self-employed, but also at industries directly affected by the crisis, including transportation and naphtha-based sectors.
Broader livelihood support is also intended to help stimulate domestic consumption. But in the long term, as an export-focused nation, we are a highly energy-dependent economy, so we eventually have to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and the transformation into an electricity-driven nation. I believe that structuring legislation and policy is absolutely necessary.
Right, then what other aspects were discussed other than the economy?
Right, so on the diplomatic front, lawmakers from both parties underscored the importance of multilateral engagement. The Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee has maintained ongoing communication with Gulf states, including meetings with their ambassadors, while also continuing dialogue with both Iran and Israel.
Our greatest strength is maintaining good relations and leveraging these strengths to ensure that our diplomatic capabilities secure the safety of our expatriates, trade, and most importantly, national interests.
But the lawmakers also stressed that the cornerstone of South Korea's response remains its alliance with the United States.
So even though under President Trump, we must try to strengthen our alliance with the United States, at the same time, we must try to have more flexibility or more strategic flexibility in preparation for a new world.
Both highlighted that efforts in the National Assembly are focused on ensuring that diplomacy serves the national interest.
Well, that is reassuring to hear. Now, with all that in mind, how does the National Assembly intend to move forward?
Right, so despite the evolving and uncertain nature in the Middle East crisis, the National Assembly says it will continue to closely monitor its impact on livelihoods and prepare measures in step with changing conditions. Now have a listen to what both of the lawmakers had to say about this.
Even after this supplementary budget, if necessary, I think we need to actively consider providing support for people's livelihoods to sectors heavily affected by high energy dependency, such as the transportation industry and the self-employed.
My thought is very clear that everybody loses when there is military this magnitude of military conflict, because this affects everyone. So I'm pretty certain that all the countries will try to help the two countries to come to an end of the military conflict as early as possible.
So it does seem like lawmakers will continue to keep an eye on how the situation is unfolding to assess the need for further measures.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Seongjin.
My pleasure as always.
Korea's new central bank chief has taken office, vowing flexible monetary policy as he confronts a weakening currency and persistent inflation, despite controversies surrounding his appointment. Our finance correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
Newly appointed Bank of Korea Governor Shin Hyun-sung took office on Tuesday, inheriting a domestic economy challenged by a struggling currency, persistent inflation, and geopolitical headwinds.
While it is an immense honor to have the opportunity to dedicate myself to the Bank of Korea and our economy, after working in overseas academia and international organizations for a long time, considering the duties entrusted to me, I feel a heavy sense of responsibility.
Acknowledging his heavy responsibility, Shin outlined his core objectives for his 4-year term. He stressed the need for flexible monetary policy and the need to expand financial monitoring into non-bank sectors, using market price indicators as an early warning system against systematic risks. He also emphasized the need for internationalization of the Korean won, confirming plans to establish a 24-hour foreign exchange market and offshore settlement systems. To secure a stable, next-generation payment infrastructure, the central bank will push forward with digital currency initiatives.
Through the second phase of Project Hangang, we will increase the utilization of CBDC and deposit tokens and elevate the status of the won in the digital payment environment through international cooperation, such as the Agora project.
Governor Shin steps into the central bank's top post at a critical juncture. The Korean won remains weak, currently trading in the 1,471 range against the US dollar. The central bank also remains in a complex policy dilemma, having frozen its base interest rate for a 7th consecutive session to balance inflationary pressures from the Middle East conflict against a sluggish domestic economy. Earning his doctoral degree in economics from the University of Oxford, Shin brings an extensive international resume to the role. He previously served as an economics professor at Princeton University and spent 12 years at the Bank for International Settlements. As for his rocky confirmation process, clouded by allegations regarding his daughter's passport and criticisms of his extensive time abroad, Shin spoke to the press after his inauguration speech and apologized for any concerns caused, asking to ultimately be evaluated by his results. Kim Do-yeon, ArirangNews.
South Korean chipmaker SK Hynix has posted record-breaking quarterly earnings fueled by booming demand for AI and memory chips. With revenue and profits hitting all-time highs, the company is extending its streak of strong performance as the global AI race accelerates. Our Park Jin-an has the details.
South Korean chip giant SK Hynix on Thursday revealed its record quarterly performance. The company's revenue was 52.58 trillion won, or around $35.5 billion, a massive 198.1% jump from the same period last year. Operating profits saw an even more dramatic rise as it reached 37.61 trillion won, up 405.5% year-on-year. This marks the first time SK Hynix has ever surpassed 50 trillion won in quarterly revenue and 30 trillion won in operating profit in a single quarter. From Thursday's record, the company has now set new all-time high earnings for 4 consecutive quarters, with the latest figure nearly double the previous operating profit of 19.17 trillion won set in the fourth quarter of 2025. What stood out was the company's operating margin, as it hit 72%, a level rarely seen in the industry and the highest in the company's history. The surge was driven by explosive demand for AI-related memory chips such as DRAM and NAND flash. Korean securities firms' estimates for the second quarter of 2026 point to revenue of around 69.5 trillion won and operating profit of 51.3 trillion won, which would extend the record-breaking streak to 5 straight quarters. Long-term supply agreements are increasing as customers lock in memory contracts amid ongoing shortages, and prices for both DRAM and NAND are forecast to keep rising. The company is also expected to resolve supply issues for its next-generation HBM4 to US chip giant NVIDIA within the first half of the year. 박준환, 아리랑뉴스.
And South Korea's economy posted its strongest quarterly growth in over 5 years in the first quarter of this year, defying market expectations. The surprise growth comes despite geopolitical risks surrounding the conflict in the Middle East. Our Kim Do-yeon has more.
According to the Bank of Korea's advanced estimate on Thursday, the nation's real gross domestic product grew by 1.7% from the previous quarter. On a yearly basis, it's grown 3.6%. This significantly outperforms expectations and overcomes concerns over the situation in the Middle East, which severely hit South Korea's energy and petroleum sector. In fact, this quarter-on-quarter figure is nearly double the central bank's earlier projection of 0.9% and marks the highest growth rate since the third quarter of 2020.
To summarize the first quarter growth, private consumption acted as a pillar of support, while strong exports centered on semiconductors and investments to expand semiconductor production capacity drove the overall growth.
Looking closely at the data, the manufacturing sector expanded by 3.9%. Overall exports surged 5.1%, heavily fueled by global demand for information technology products. This resulted in net exports contributing 1.1 percentage points to the overall economic growth figure. Domestic demand also showed a solid recovery, adding 0.6 percentage points to the GDP. Facilities investment climbed 4.8% and construction investment rose 2.8%. Private consumption grew by 0.5%, supported by increased spending on goods like clothing. Additionally, real gross domestic income surged 7.5% on quarter. This marks the highest increase since the first quarter of 1988, indicating a significant expansion in the nation's purchasing power due to improved terms of trade. Meanwhile, the government attributed this strong performance to both favorable market conditions and active policy interventions.
In addition to strong exports driven by the semiconductor boom, policy effects such as capital market revitalization and consumption support measures contributed greatly. I also believe our swift response to the Middle East war played a part.
He added that as ceasefire negotiations are delayed and uncertainties remain high, the government will not let its guard down. Prior to this release, the Bank of Korea had projected an annual economic growth rate of 2.1% for the year. But with the positive surprise growth in the first quarter and the negative impact of the Middle East situation expected to become clearer in the second quarter, the public now waits to see which factor weighs the most on the annual growth rate. Kim Do-yeon, ArirangNews.
Seoul says military readiness remains unaffected despite a partial U.S. move to limit certain intelligence sharing on North Korea. Our Oh Seong has the details.
Seoul says core monitoring of North Korea remains unchanged, despite the United States partially restricting intelligence sharing. A South Korean military official told Yonhap news agency on Tuesday that restriction has been in place since early this month, involving some satellite-collected data on North Korean technologies. The official stressed the move does not affect military readiness, with South Korea and the US continuing to share key intelligence on North Korean military activities, including missile launches. The restriction follows remarks by Unification Minister Chung Dong-young in early March, when he referred to Gusong in North Pyongan province as a possible location of a uranium enrichment facility, alongside previously known sites. Washington is believed to have protested, saying sensitive intelligence it had shared was disclosed without prior consultation, and has reportedly asked Seoul to take steps to prevent a recurrence. Concerns had been raised that the move could weaken South Korea's reliance on US intelligence, particularly as North Korea has stepped up provocations since its 9th Party Congress earlier this year. But the military says the restricted information is not critical and that joint monitoring remains intact. They point to North Korea's missile launch on Sunday, when it fired multiple ballistic missiles from the Sinpo area. South Korea and the US had already detected unusual activity in advance and were closely monitoring the area, including the possibility of a submarine-launched ballistic missile or SLBM. Officials add that multiple examples of North Korean submarine movements have recently been identified near Sinpo, raising the assessment that an SLBM launch could be imminent. Meanwhile, the Unification Minister has defended his remarks, saying they were part of a policy explanation and reiterating that the Gusong facility is based on open-source information. He expressed concern over speculation of a crisis in Korea-US relations and said he hopes the issue will be resolved through communication between the allies. President Lee Jae-myung has also rejected claims of a leak, saying the reference to a Gusong facility was already publicly known through academic papers and media reports, calling the allegations unfounded. Oh Soo-young, ArirangNews.
That brings us to the end of Weekly News Highlights. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your weekend.